Hi. So today we've come to Pirkei, chapter 5. Originally, Pirkei Avot, Ethics of the Fathers, was only 5 chapters, so this would have been the last chapter. Sometime Middle Ages, a 6th chapter was added. When we get there, we'll explain why and how. So we're coming to what would have been the 5th and final chapter of the original text of Mishnah, Pirkei Avot, Ethics of the Sages. Remember, chapter 1 began by taking us from Moses all the way down to the 1st century. And then we went one generation after another and learning about all the great leaders and all of the great statements of the great leaders. The bulk of Pirkei Avot is rabbis who were sometime between the destruction of the temple by the Romans in the year 70 and the defeat of the rebels led by Shimon Bar Kokhba in the year 135. And mostly what we have are rabbis attempting to deal with these twin catastrophes and to try to rebuild Judaism based on the fact that the temple sacrifices, everything that was the basis of Judaism is now gone, and we need to build a new foundation. And these rabbis attempted to do that through their moral lessons and ethical teachings in Pirkei Avot. Okay, so in chapters 1, 2, 3, and 4, we've seen one rabbi after another. Now we come to chapter 5, which is different in 2 significant ways. Number one, we're not going to read so much about rabbis. We're not going to read names. Mostly we have anonymous statements and teachings. The other thing to note is that chapter 5 is organized by numbers. We're going to see a whole series of things that are connected to the number 10. Then we're going to go to the number 7. Then we're going to see a series of things to the number 4, etc. So these key numbers are seemingly the way that everything is being organized at this time. So let's dive in, chapter 5. If you've got a Siddur, it's on page 252. If you've got another edition of Pirkei Avot, we're on chapter 5, beginning from the very start. So, Pirkei, Mishnah Aleph. We read the following. Bi'asara ma'amarot, with 10 statements, nivra ha'olam. God created the world with 10 sayings or statements. So what exactly are we talking about? So if you go through Genesis, first chapter, you'll find that there are 10, maybe less, maybe more, but 10 basic statements that God said in creating the world. So here's how one traditional commentator, the Vilna Gaon, explains it. He says, in the beginning of God's creating the heaven and the earth. To him, to the Vilna Gaon, that was the first one. The second one, God said, let there be light. Third, God said, let there be a firmament, the heaven. Number 4, let the waters beneath the heavens be gathered into one area, and let the dry land appear. Number 5, God said, let the earth sprout vegetation. Number 6, God said, let there be luminaries in the firmament of the heaven, sun and moon. Number 7, God said, let the waters teem with living creatures. Number 8, God said, let the earth bring forth living creatures. Number 9, God said, let us make man in our image. And number 10, behold, I have given to you all herbage yielding seed that is on the surface of the entire earth, and every tree that has seed yielding fruit. It shall be yours for food. By the way, there are other commentators who say you can't really count that first one, in the beginning God created the heaven and the earth. That's not really a statement of God in the process of creating. So they skip that one, and they say number 10 in this series will be found in the second chapter, where ultimately God says to Adam, it is not good for man to be alone, right? Be fruitful and multiply, as he brings Eve. Okay, so one of the things that we see here, the very fact that there is this disagreement about were there really 10 statements, and how many times did actually God say, Yehi something, let there be light, let there be a heaven, let there be waters, right? It doesn't actually come to 10. So what I think what we're seeing here is that the rabbis were really looking to squeeze in 10. How do we get 10, even though it may not be so obvious that there are 10 statements? The idea of making this structure that fits what they're trying to say becomes more important than the fact of whether or not God actually did say 10 times, let there be whatever. Okay, so why is this important? Why is the fact that, yes, God said 10 things in creating the world? Number one, why is 10 so important? And number two, if God is all powerful, why couldn't God have simply said, let the earth come about? And in one statement, in one act of creation, poof, we could have had everything that we now have. Why does God have to, seemingly in Genesis, go through these steps one at a time? So, that's going to be the ultimate question here. And by the way, going back to the Mishnah, it says, Ma Talmud Lomar. Why does the Torah say this? In other words, why are, presuming that there are 10 statements, why did there have to be 10? V'halo be'ma'amar echad yachol lehi barot. Couldn't God, who can do anything, couldn't God have created everything with one statement? Why is the need for 10? Ella, rather it is to teach you, lehi para min harishaim. It is to increase the punishment that is due to the wicked. Sheme'abedin et ha'olam, who come to destroy the world, shenivra be'asara ma'amarot, which was created by 10 statements. In other words, the fact that God said, let the world come into being, and then comes along bad people, evil people, wicked people, who are going to undermine the world, destroy the world in whatever way, whether it's by polluting it, whether it's by violence, whatever. The idea is that their punishment is tenfold, because what they are doing is they are undoing not one thing that God did, for which there would be one punishment, but 10 things that God did, for which there would be 10 punishments. Okay, so the fact that God laid out the world in these different steps is to show us how precious the world is and how terrible it is to destroy the world that God created in this manner. And the flip side of the coin is v'litain sachar tov, and to give a wonderful punishment, latzadikim, for righteous people, shemekayimim et ha'olam, who, in a sense, who sustain the world, which was shenivra, which was created bi asara ma'amarot, which was created through 10 utterances. Okay, they will be 10 times, they will receive 10 times the reward for doing things which keep the world together. In other words, people who preserve life, preserve the environment, people who help give life to living creatures as opposed to destroying living creatures. Okay, so that's the notion. Where do they come up with the idea of 10? Why is that significant? Well, numbers have symbolic significance. As we're going to see in a little bit, the number 7 represents heaven or God. How so? This is fascinating. If you lived 2,000 years ago and you looked up in the sky and you were familiar with constellations, you would see that constellations are pretty fixed in the sky, but there were 7 things in the sky that were not fixed, that they kept moving. And what were those 7? To the naked eye, 2,000 years ago, those 7 things were sun, moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. Right? 7 planets, sun and the moon, those were 7 things. So people understood this very well, that 7, and they thought the earth was the center of life. So we look up and we see 7 things moving in the heavens. Therefore, the number 7 equals something to do with heaven and therefore something to do with God. The number 7 is symbolic of God and godliness. Okay, so and maybe that's why the world is God creates the earth in 7 days, and the 7th day is the Sabbath to the Lord, etc., etc., etc. The 7th month of the year, according to the Jewish calendar, that's the month of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur and Sukkot. Right? It's the month in which we basically come to deal with God. So that's the significance of the number 7. It's all about God in heaven. What is the significance of the number 10? Well, 10 is obviously our fingers. That's obviously about humanity, about people. So ultimately, the number 10 represents humanity, people. Number 7 represents God. So we're beginning to see the way that the rabbis thought, and goes before the rabbis, even to the biblical notion. So number 1 is, we're told that God, yes, it's God who created with 10 statements, but it's a play, he created the world, which is the place of man, humanity. 10 equals 10. And therefore, any human being that comes to destroy the world, right, with his own 10 fingers and 2 hands, that person gets the 10-fold punishment. Anybody who with their 10 fingers and 2 hands comes to sustain the world, build the world, strengthen the world, they get 10-fold reward. Okay. One other thing, perhaps from a modern point of view, another way of looking at this is physicists today will speak about the Big Bang, right? At the beginning of history, there was this moment where there was an explosion, a Big Bang, and everything from that one act, everything developed. Things shoot out. You've got fire, you've got heat, you've got cooling down, you've got gases which turn into rock, which ultimately you've got hydrogen, helium, oxygen, and the beginnings of what's life, and then life on its own begins to evolve from one cell to the complexity of human beings. So physicists would seem to be speaking about, there was one, God said, let the world come into being. And whether it was God or whether it was God creating the Big Bang or the Big Bang in and of itself independently, we'll leave that for a different class. But the idea was, Pirkei Avot is saying God chose evolution rather than this great Big Bang theory. That here we have one step at a time, and the world is created one step and then another step. And again, we begin with let there be light, let there be a heaven, let there be waters, let there be vegetation, let there be the sun and the moon, let there be fish, let there be animals, let us make man. So the process that the first chapter of Genesis seems to describe, seems to mirror what we would refer to as evolution. Now, I'm not saying that the rabbis in the 2nd century understood from our point of view that notion, right? But clearly that's the point that they seem to be making. So that's our first Mishnah. 10 statements in the creation of the world. Okay, Mishnah number 2. Asara dorot. There were 10 generations. Me Adam, from Adam, ad Noach, until Noah. And indeed, if you read carefully the begat section, which few of us do, that's to most people pretty boring, and we can't even pronounce most of the names anyway. But if you count the names, you'll notice that if you look at early history, what are the key? We start with Adam. The next major figure is going to be Noah. And after him, the next major figure is going to be Abraham. And the rabbis figure out, from here to here, there were 10. From here to here, there were 10. So who were the 10 from Adam to Noah? First generation is Adam. Second generation is Shet, his son Seth. Then the next generation is Enosh. Next generation is Canaan. Then you have Mahalalel is the 5th. 6th generation is Yared or Jared in the English. 7th generation is Enoch, Hanoch in Hebrew. 8th generation is Metushelach. We know him as Methuselah, the man who lives longer than anybody else in the Torah. Then you have Lamech, and Lamech is the father of Noach. So from Adam to Noah inclusive, we have 10 generations. Okay, that's a nice way of breaking things up. What's the point? Okay, why did God do that? So, lehodia, to teach us, kama erech apayim lifanav, how patient God was. Shakol hadorot, every one of those generations, beginning with Adam and what Adam and Eve did in the Garden of Eden, disobeying God, all the way up to the time of Noah. Hayu machisin lifanav. They were all getting God angry. Machisin from the word kas, okay, anger. They were all ticking God off. Ad shehevi alehem et me hamabul. Until by the 10th generation, God had it, he's finished, and I'm going to wipe these people out. But you got to be pretty impressive that somebody would have waited 10 generations before he let his anger say, that's it, I've had it, they're all gone. Okay, now, the point being here that look how patient and forgiving God was. 10 generations he he took a deep breath and he didn't intervene until the flood, when he wiped all humanity out except for Noah and his family. You can imagine that people who were living in the second century, people who dealt with the destruction of the temple, who dealt with the defeat of Bar Kokhba, and people looking around and saying the Jews have done terrible things, and that's why all of this came upon them. Ultimately, maybe one of the lessons here is that, God is a little bit more patient than you give him credit for, right? Maybe he was patient with us. And therefore, it's not to blame God, it's to blame ourselves. All of this came about because of what we did, what we brought upon ourselves. And God, thank God, he was patient. He was patient then. He's been patient with us. So that's the second Mishnah. Now we come to the third Mishnah. We're continuing from this process, moving on in history, and 10 generations. Asara dorot minoach ad Avraham. And now there were 10 generations from Noah to Abraham. Okay, so what were those generations? So we know that we've got Shem, who was from whom, of course, we get the Semite. The word Semite comes from the son of Noah, Shem. Then his son, Arpachshad, his son, Shelach, fourth generation, Aver. Eber in Hebrew. It's from Aver that some people think we get the notion of Hebrew. Hebrews can trace themselves back to Aver. The fifth generation was Peleg, sixth generation was Reu, seventh generation Serug, eighth generation was Nahor, ninth generation was Terach, and the 10th generation was Abraham. Okay, so we've divided up the history. Hey, it's all in the Torah, and all of those names, the 20 generations from Adam to up to Abraham, they're all there. So in a sense, the rabbis are right. They're just writing down what the Torah already told us. So the question is, what's the lesson of this next group? Lehodia, to teach us kama erech hapayim lifanav, how patient God was. Shekol hadorot hayu machisin lifanav. All of those generations, as soon as Noah got off the boat, Noah began to mess up again. We're told first thing he does is he plants a vineyard, he squeezes the grapes, gets himself drunk, and he uncovers himself, and his sons see him in a state of drunken nakedness. So, God might have said at that moment, this is what I started over with, forget it. But no, God says, okay, I've got to be patient. Maybe things will progress. Ad sheba Avraham v'kibel sachar kulam. And we're told that terrible things happen, the Tower of Babel, and we read other, horrible things that are going on in those generations. And finally, instead of God destroying the world, guy number 10 is Abraham, who pleases God so much that he says, I'm not going to destroy the world. If there wasn't an Abraham, I probably would have, just like I did, when I came to Noah. But Abraham was much greater than Noah. So we have, God says, I'm pleased with where Abraham is going to take things. Brings us to Mishnah Daled, Mishnah number 4. Asara nisyonot nitnasa Avraham Avinu. 10 trials or tests was Abraham had in his life. Ve'amad bekulam, and he overcame them all. Literally, he stood up to all of them. And now let's a word about the word nes. Nes, we all know, nes gadol hayasham, means a miracle. But actually, the word nes originally meant a banner. You know, you fly a banner. And the word nisayon from the word nes apparently comes from the concept of a trial, right? Something that maybe it's a miracle that you need in order to overcome this, or once you stand up to this trial, it's as if there's a flag proclaiming how great and wonderful what you have done is. So here we're told that in his life, Abraham went through 10 trials, 10 difficult things. V'amad bekulam, and he stood up to all of these trials. What were these 10 trials that Abraham had to deal with? So here's one way of looking at them. Two of Abraham's trials were when he had to move. He originally lived in Ur in Mesopotamia. God says, Lech lecha me'artzecha, get you out of your land, your father's house, go to the land I'm going to show you. So imagine in those days, somebody who picks themselves up from what was the most advanced place in the world, Mesopotamia, and you're going to travel 500, 800 miles along the Euphrates and then down into Canaan. Canaan in those days was a backwater compared to what Ur was and what Mesopotamia was, Sumeria. So he had to leave his home and go to this new place, new language, new everything. That was the first great trial. The second one was he gets to this place and there's no food. And he's got to leave there and he's got to go to Egypt. So Abraham underwent these two trials about moving. Then there were two trials concerning his son. First one is he had to kick out his firstborn, Ishmael, because his wife Sarah refused to let Ishmael live in the house. This for Abraham, getting rid of, sending into the desert, exiling his firstborn was a difficult trial for him. And of course, his second great trial concerning a son was what happened with Isaac. God says, take your son, your only son now, and offer him as a sacrifice on one of the mountains. So we've got now 4 trials that Abraham went through. Twice, 2 more trials in reference to his wives. So Sarah was taken from Abraham once they get to Egypt, and Pharaoh was ready to marry her, thinking Abraham is her brother. And so we're also told that, Hagar having Sarah not being able to have children, saying, marry my handmaid, and all the trouble that caused in the household between Sarah and Hagar. That's another 2 trials that Abraham went through. So we're up to 6. Then we've got number 7, chapter 14 of Genesis, where Abraham's nephew Lot is kidnapped and taken hostage, and Abraham has to go to war and fight the 4 kings in order to free his nephew. Right? So that brings us to number 7. Then we're told there is number 8, the covenant between the parts. He was told, take an animal, chop it in 2, separate the pieces, walk between the pieces, and God says, and I will give you a vision of what is going to befall your children. And of course, God tells him at that point, your descendants will ultimately become slaves in Egypt for hundreds of years. Can you imagine the difficulty of being told the future, horrible future for your children? This was another of the ultimately of the trials that Abraham had to face and deal with. Then, according to the rabbis, we're told that back when he was still in Ur Kasdim and he broke his father's idols, and King Nimrod saw Abraham as a threat to everything that the society was based on, and Abraham was thrown into the fiery furnace to be burned, right, as an example. And we're told that at that moment, an angel protected, shielded Abraham. It's from that story that we get the first blessing in the Amidah, Baruch atah Adonai Magen Avraham. God, you were the one who shielded Abraham when he was thrown into the fiery furnace. Shielded him from the heat. The door was open. Abraham was able to emerge. And finally, the 10th of the trials that Abraham faced was he's being asked to circumcise himself when he's 99 years old. Okay, for an old man that age to undergo that kind of surgery and to do it himself, on himself, that too was a physical trial. So here we have the 10 trials. By the way, you'll notice that the Mishnah doesn't list them. It's the commentaries that do. And in fact, some of the commentaries come up with a different list of 10, right? They differ exactly which 10. So once again, the rabbis are intent on giving structure to history. History is not random. Things don't just happen. There's a plan, and the plan is structured, and it's mathematical, and it's beautiful, and there's significance, and the fact that 10 generations and now 10 trials. So everything, in a sense, God has laid out. Now, whether we believe that or not is a different story, but the rabbis believe that, and that's what they're trying to convey to us in the Mishnah here. So why did Abraham have to undergo all these trials? Lehodia, to teach us, kama chibato, how beloved was God to Avraham Avinu, to Abraham our father. That Abraham was willing to undergo these 10 trials. You know, God says, hitch your wagon to me. Abraham does. And what happens? A life of happiness and wealth and all good things? No. He's got a life of one trouble, one trial after another. And at no point, despite the difficulties, was Abraham going to wash his hands of God. He was sticking with God no matter what happens. Okay, one of the interesting points that this makes, we all go through life. We all suffer trials and tribulations. We might think, I'm a good person. I believe, I go to shul, I keep kosher, I do this, I give tzedakah, whatever it is. Why did this bad stuff happen to me? In a sense, the rabbis are saying, hey, a lot worse happened to Abraham, and you're no Abraham. If this stuff happened to Abraham, this happens to everybody, right? There's no guarantees in life, and you don't get a free pass. So that's the point. And what's not written here, but's clearly between the lines, is the idea of the rabbis who wrote this, remember, had lived through terrible things: defeat, death, plague, famine, horrible things done to their family members, horrible things done to their people, to their temple, to their religion, right? And people say, why is all this happening? We tried to be good. And the answer here, without an explanation, but the hint is, look, a lot worse happened to Abraham. and yet he was faithful. Therefore, be like Abraham, right? Be faithful no matter what happens. We can't, as we've already seen in the previous chapter, we can't explain why bad things happen to good people, but it does. They do. And Abraham was faithful to God despite it. We need to be faithful to God despite it all. Okay, next Mishnah. Mishnah number Hey, chapter 5, Mishnah 5. Asara nisim, 10 miracles, na'asu la'avotenu b'mitzrayim. There were 10 miracles that were done for our fathers in Egypt, the Asara al Hayam. And then there were 10 miracles at the sea. Now, Eser Makot Hevi HaKadosh Baruch Hu al HaMitzrim b'Mitzrayim. What are the 10 miracles that happened in Egypt? These are the 10 plagues that we've already known about. Dam, Tzfardeh, Kini, Mara, Dever, Shlim, Barad, Arba, Choshech, Makat, Bechorot. We know that God brought 10 plagues upon the Egyptians. The Israelites were spared these plagues. Because of those 10 plagues, the Egyptians ultimately decided to release the Israelites. They were freed from slavery. So that one, everybody knew, everybody agrees what exactly they are. So that's the first part of this. But here's the second part, which is a surprise to us. We're told the Asara al Hayam. There were 10 miracles that took place at the sea. Now, most of us would have assumed that there was one miracle that happened at the sea. The Israelites come to the Red Sea, the Yam Suf, the Sea of Reeds. Egyptians are here, the sea is there. Moses lifts his rod, the sea splits, the people go through, and the sea comes back on top of the Egyptians. They're drowned. The Israelites are free. One miracle at the sea. But the rabbis tell us, no, there were actually 10 miracles at the sea. That what we thought was one was really much more. So what are they? And once again, depending on which rabbi you talk to, which text you read, there might be a little bit of a disagreement about what exactly are the 10. But again, we need to come up with 10, because the fact that 10, 10, 10, we keep repeating this, shows that there's structure, that there's planning, that everything is not random, right? That it was all meant. So what were the 10 miracles that occurred at the Red Sea? So here's one explanation of them. The sea split. We all knew that one. Tunnels were formed in the sea. We thought, according to the movie, sea splits, people go right up the middle. As actually what happened is the sea split into 12 different tunnels, one for each tribe. Each tribe went through their own tunnel. Number 3, the seabed was dry, allowing the Jews to pass through comfortably and unimpeded. So the sea would split if you have a low tide. It's going to be muddy underneath, but not for the Jews. It was their sandals didn't even get wet as they were walking through these tunnels. Then we're told later the seabed turned into a muddy morass, stopping the Egyptians in their pursuit of the Jews. So what had been dry now becomes mud. That's the 4th. 5th, the waters solidified into a rock-like substance that caused injury to the Egyptians. It was not just that the water came over them, but that the water became hard as stone and hit them, and they were, in a sense, not just drowned, but they were killed by the water rocks that were hitting them. Number 6, the sea waters formed into perfectly shaped bricks Number 7, the walls formed by the water created 12 separate corridors, allowing each of the 12 tribes an independent passage. Seems similar to what we said before about tunnels. Number 8, the walls were transparent, allowing each tribe to see the others passing through the sea. So imagine you're walking through the tunnel. It's just your tribe, but you can look through the water, which is clear glass, and you can see the next tribe walking there, but there's a separation. Number 9, the sweet water in the sea remained in liquid form to quench the thirst of the Jews. In other words, as they were going through their glass tunnels, people got thirsty. So it's almost like there was a water fountain, and you could take a cup of water out of the wall and drink it, or maybe it was squirting a little bit for little kids to get a drink. And number 10, the remaining sweet water froze in place, ready for when the Jews would need to drink again. So whatever was one miracle we thought, no, it's 10 times greater than what you thought. Maybe one of the messages is that things that we see in the world are maybe a lot more wonderful and miraculous than we give them credit for, right? So, okay, the water split and we went through. No, there's actually 10 great miracles that happened at this point to get us through that moment. God's greatness, his power, was even more wonderful than you might think, okay? So that's the 10 miracles in Egypt and at the sea. Then we come to Mishnah number 6. Asara nisyonot nisu avotenu et hamakom baruchu bamidbar. Now, after the Red Sea, after Egypt, the Red Sea, we get to the desert. And there were 10 trials, 10 tests of the forefathers of God. Here it's not, God, what God did for us, it's what we did bad to God. There were 10 occasions when we questioned God, rebelled against God, challenged God. And once again, depending on which rabbis you ask and which texts you look at, there might be a disagreement about which are the actual 10. But again, we've got to come up with 10. Because that proves the point about structure. So what were the 10 things? When the Egyptians pursued the Israelites at the sea, the Jews told Moses they would have preferred to remain slaves in Egypt. So that was the first time that they ticked God off. Can you imagine? 10 plagues have now freed you. You're free people. And all of a sudden, the Egyptians, they see behind them, they say, we wish we could go back. We'd rather be slaves again. This is no fun. Who needs this? So God said, all I did for them, and they want to go back. That's number 1. Number 2, they complained when they had nothing to drink. They come to Marah in chapter 15 in the book of Exodus, and there's only bitter water, and that's, of course, when Moses was going to strike the rock. Number 3, they complained again when they ran out of food. There's no food. All the matzah they brought is gone. And that's when ultimately the miracle of manna. Number 4, they were told, only take what you need with the manna each day. Don't store it. People said, well, we don't trust God. How do we know it's going to come tomorrow? They took more than they should have, than they needed. They didn't listen to God. And then, of course, the next day, manna did fall, and what they had already collected was full of maggots and worms, right? God was ticked off once again. Then they were told, you can only go out 6 days a week. Do not go to collect manna on Shabbat. And of course, people went out on Shabbat to collect manna. There wasn't any. That's why twice as much fell on Friday. So once again, people don't listen to God. They tested God's patience. Then there's a second incident, chapter 17, where they run out of water. And once again, they complain to God and to Moses. Number 7 is the golden calf. Imagine how God felt. Looks down, sees the people worshiping an idol after all he's done for them. That was the 7th. Then we're told another rebellion in the book of Numbers, chapter 11, against God's commandments. They were sick, and also in Numbers 11, they were sick and tired of this manna. Yeah, it comes 6 days a week. Yeah, there's enough for us to eat, but we don't like the taste. We wish we had meat, right? And then 10, when the spies came and said, you don't want to go to the land of Canaan. There are giants there. They're going to eat us up. At that point, the people rebelled against God. So here are 10 incidents where the people over and over and over again rebel against God. And we're told, Shne'emar in Numbers 14, God says, these people, they tested me. They turned their back on me these 10 times. V'lo shamu b'koli. And once again, the point is, despite the fact that Jews can be obnoxious and stiff-necked, nevertheless, God never turned his back. He had patience. And hopefully, between the lines, the rabbis are saying, so too, despite all the things we've done to make God angry at us, he's not going to turn his back on us. Mishnah number 7. Here we go. Asara nisim na'asu lavotenu bebeit hamikdash. Once the temple was built by Solomon, okay, there were 10 miracles that regularly happened in the temple, and the Mishnah actually brings us what they were, unlike the other Mishnayot where we don't have them. So, what were the 10 miracles? No woman miscarried from the scent of sacrificial meat. Imagine there were pregnant women who went to the temple. What do you smell? Dead animals, burning animals. You might have thought that one pregnant woman of the hundreds and thousands who came to the temple for all those years, one might have gotten so sick from the smell that she might have suffered a miscarriage. Didn't happen once. Now, is this a scientific fact, a historical fact? Seems more like in the realm of the miraculous. Number 2, the sacrificial meat never became putrid. They didn't have refrigeration. You've got animals that are killed, the meat is lying around. You would have thought that one time, one piece of meat got rancid. Never. Again, can you prove it? No, but this was the belief, that there was something about the temple that was supernatural, that God was protecting the temple back then to make sure that bad things didn't happen. No fly was ever seen in the slaughterhouse. Like we believe that. All the dead animals, there was not one single fly. But can you imagine what the temple would have been like with all these burning, the dead meat, the dead animals, the burning meat, and no flies anywhere? The high priest never became ritually impure on Yom Kippur. The high priest had to be in a state of purity when he went into the temple to ask God's forgiveness. And we're told that on the night of Kol Nidre night, suppose, God forbid, he had a nocturnal emission, right? Seminal emission. That would have rendered him ritually impure. He would not have been allowed to go into the temple on Yom Kippur morning to do what he had to do. Never happened. In the hundreds of years history, not once did that ever happen. Can we prove it? No. The rains never extinguished the fire of the woodpile. The animals were sacrificed. They were placed on the altar. This was outside the building so that the smoke could rise up in the courtyard up to the sky. You're telling me not once when they did these sacrifices did the rain ever come and extinguish the altar fire and the meat? Never once did it happen. No wind dispersed the column of smoke. And again, part of the beauty of the sacrifices is you saw this magnificent column of smoke rise from the altar up to heaven. Not once did the wind, since this was outside, not once did the wind come and blow the smoke. It was always a beautiful column. No defect was found in the omer, the 2 loaves, or the showbread. People brought the wheat from Passover to Shavuot. There were never, and nothing was ever bad about the wheat that was always brought. On Shavuos, they had to bring 2 loaves of challah or pita as a contribution. Nor every week they had to bring 12 loaves of pita or challah into the temple, and never was something moldy or bad or no good. The people stood pressed together. Imagine all these people who are coming into the temple, especially on a pilgrimage festival. They're all basically shoulder to shoulder, so many Jews coming into this finite area, yet they knelt in ease. When it came time to bow down, and they didn't just bow at the waist, they bowed on the floor. People are all standing shoulder to shoulder, and yet when they have to bow down, they're all able to do it, and everybody has room. How could that be? Again, another miracle that took place in the temple. And we're told no scorpion or serpent ever injured anyone in Jerusalem. Okay? You'd think that in those days somebody might have gotten bitten by a scorpion or a snake. Never happened. And finally, no one complained, "It is too crowded for me to lodge overnight in Jerusalem." Everybody always found a hotel room. Remember, Jesus's parents found no room in the inn when they were coming at a difficult time. They had to sleep in the barn on the straw. When all these hundreds and thousands of people came to Jerusalem, everybody was able to find a place to stay. And the final one, Mishnah number 8, we come to, this is the final of the 10s. And so we read the following. Asara devarim nivra'u be'erev Shabbat. 10 things were created on the Friday afternoon, Bein Hashmashot, the Elohim. Remember, in the week of creation, according to the book of Genesis, man is created on Friday, the 6th day, and when the sun goes down, that's going to be Shabbat, and God's going to rest. At the last moments on Friday afternoon, Adam and Eve are already created. Everything is done. It's the sun is beginning to set. It's almost Shabbat. And we're told that God said, oh yeah, there's 10 more things I need to do. What did God have to do at the last minute? So we're told the mouth of the earth. In the story of Korach, when Korach tries to rebel against Moses, ultimately the earth opens up and Korach and 250 of his followers fall into the ground and are in hell, as it were. God created that mouth right beforehand, not at that moment. It was pre-programmed that God knew what would happen, and he took care of all these things that we might think are miraculous. Didn't just happen at the spur of the moment. They were pre-planned, pre-programmed into creation. Okay, number one. Number two, the mouth of the well. We're told that there was a well that actually followed the Israelites for 40 years in the desert, right? And if they needed water, the well went with them. Number three, the speech of the ass. Remember, Balaam is hired by Balak to put a curse on the Israelites, and we're told that he's riding his donkey. The donkey sees an angel. Balaam doesn't see the angel. He hits the donkey. Donkey turns around and says, "Why are you hitting me?" Right? A talking donkey, right? And here we're told God created the talking donkey at the very beginning of creation. It was there ready to be used at that moment. The rainbow, in the first rainbow that appeared. Look, today we understand rainbows, the prism, spectrum, light through droplets of water. We're told the rainbow was a miraculous creation by God Friday afternoon in the week of creation. The manna, right? Clearly something that falls from heaven that you can eat and that gives you sustenance, and for 40 years, so the people had enough food. The rod, the stick of Moses, which was able to turn the Nile into blood, which was able to split the Red Sea, that was created before at the time of creation. The shamir. A shamir is a tiny worm. The legend is that when Solomon built the temple, they didn't use hammer and chisel. The idea was that these were considered implements of destruction, war tools, and you didn't do that. You didn't use something to destroy in building the temple. So how could you build those beautiful blocks if you've seen the Kotel, the Western Wall, right, that we're trying to replicate here? How did you get these perfectly squared blocks? So what happened is there was a little worm that had diamond teeth, and they put little food on this rock, and this tiny shamir worm would eat the food and break through the rock, and that's how the stones were created. You believe that? Not sure if I do, but that was the legend. And again, it goes to telling us how much more miraculous and special the temple was. The script, the Ten Commandments, the actual writing of the Ten Commandments in the stone, and the writing instrument and the tablets, those were all part of miracles created. What was so miraculous? We're told that the Ten Commandments were written in such a way, it wasn't just etched, but it was cut through, right? So if you can imagine, look, if you had a letter, right, and then it was cut through the stone, this way it would be backwards, right? This way it would be frontwards, this way it would be backwards. But we're told the miracle was that this way it read correctly and this way it read correctly. And not only that, what we would call an O, what they would call the samach, you'd have the middle part of the O with the piece that was hanging without anything holding it together. It was like miraculously in midair. Right, so that's part of the miracle there. Others add the demons, the fact that there are demons, these little creatures throughout the world who seem to go around undoing things. They're not a separate part of creation. They were part of what God originally created. The burial place of Moses, that at the time that God created Adam and Eve, he also decided Moses is going to need a burial place. I'm not going to take out my shovel then and dig it. So there was a grave that was dug at the time of Adam that had been waiting on the Mount Nebo rather, for Moses when his time of death. The ram for our father Abraham. The fact that there was a ram when Abraham was ready to sacrifice Isaac, the ram was already caught. That ram had already been planned and was ready to go from the time of Adam and Eve until the time of Abraham, which is 20 generations later. And some add, so you see our number, depending on who you ask, is much more than 10, but again, we need to focus on 10. Some add tongues, which must be made with tongues. And here you have a very interesting technical problem. If you need tongues in order to make tongues, because you got to hold something, right? A pair of tongues, like scissors, and you got to place the metal into molten fire and then dip it into water to cool it. Well, the first pair of tongues, what are you going to use to hold the first pair of tongues? The answer is that God had already created a pair of tongues at the time of Adam to be used to make the next pair of tongues. Once that happened, you had that. So it's almost like a joke, a joke of logic. How could you make the first pair of tongues if you didn't have a pair of tongues already? And we're told God had them. They were already there. Okay, so we've completed the first 8 Mishnayot, and we've all gone according to 10. Next week, we'll pick up and we'll move into the number 7. See you then.